Thank you for that prayer, Brother Tim. Let's turn our Bibles to Acts chapter 18. We're going to continue our study in the book of Acts, and what we're seeing now is the beginnings of the church at Corinth, which we have two letters in the New Testament to the Corinthian church, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, or, as a former president said, 1 and 2 Corinthians. And I love this chapter because it reminds me of my yearbooks in years gone by. Everybody here participate in the yearbook in your elementary, middle school, high school, where it's just a snapshot of what you looked like in that particular year. Everybody have the same experience. Your middle school pictures are actually a conspiracy between your parents and the teachers for blackmail material in your future years. Or did y'all all look so beautiful? Yeah. My pictures are so dorky. Anyway, what we have here are snapshots of pictures and the lives of people that we're going to be introduced to in the Church of Corinth. And we're going to study it this week and next week, but I'd like to look at the first few verses today because I think there's some power here just looking at the snapshots of who we're dealing with. So let's jump right on in, Acts chapter 18. It says, after these things, Paul departed Athens and came to Corinth. Let's just pause real quick because I want to look at the first snapshot, and that's a person by the name of the Apostle Paul. And here's the thing that we do in Christianity. We kind of turn the apostles and the disciples into superheroes, 10 feet tall and bulletproof. But I want you to think for a moment about the Apostle Paul at this moment in time and the doubts that he had and the struggles that he went through. And I say this because we're not going to get a few verses down the road until it says that the Lord came to Paul and said, Paul, fear not. So we know that Paul was a man who got afraid once in a while. As a matter of fact, when he was writing to the Corinthian church, he said, I came to you in trembling and weakness and in much fear. So we know that the Apostle Paul struggled. And I say that because his snapshot looks like your snapshot, looks like my snapshot. Because every single one of us in this church is dealing with something that makes us afraid once in a while. And it's because we are of human nature. And so many times we try to glamorize the apostles and the disciples of the Christian church, and we put them on big pedestals. But we forget that they struggled just like we did. And I'm wondering at this moment when the Apostle Paul came to the church of Corinth, I wonder if he had the thought that John would have surely had the thought that here we go again. Because when you look at the ministry and the pattern of the Apostle Paul, what you see is Paul would go to a city, he would preach, he would get reviled, and he would be escorted out, he would jailed, he would be imprisoned. It didn't go that well. And then he would go to the next city, and he would preach, and he would be reviled, and he would be imprisoned, and then it didn't go that well. And then he'd go to the next city. And now, finally, he went to Athens. He's preaching at Mars Hill, and maybe the reaction isn't so much that he went to Athens, but that he started talking about their unknown God in the public square. But then it didn't go well, and now he's come to Corinth. And it says, and Paul departed Athens and came to Corinth. And I wonder in that journey, like in his journey, like in your journey, if he was having the same thoughts that you and I have, where he questions his calling, where he questions whether or not he's even on the right path. Surely the Apostle Paul at this moment has had this thought. Barnabas, John Mark, Lord, what, I can't believe that I'm sitting here struggling and serving you, and I had that trouble with Barnabas. Lord, can't you show Barney that he is wrong? And you just gave me my new interns, Timothy and Silas, but Lord, what's to protect it from happening like it did with John Mark and they just get up and leave? And maybe he had questions like that, or maybe he was just thinking about the physical pain that he had endured because he had been beaten, he had been shackled, he had been imprisoned. And then it took an earthquake to get him out. And so maybe he's like, Lord, why do evil men continue to keep getting away with things like this? And what about that moment in Berea, Lord, when it seemed like everything was good because those people would actually listen to check it against the word, but then I got thrown in prison. Lord, why does it have to be so hard with you? And Lord, can't you see that I'm fully invested? And sure, along the way, some really good things happened. There was Lydia. There was Damaris. There were other leading women, the Philippian jailer, who came to know the Lord because of the preaching of the Apostle Paul. They were God's children struggling, and they came to know the truth. And he would have those moments. And the Apostle Paul surely had thoughts like this. And maybe when he came to the church of Corinth, trembling and fearing, it was because he was a man of like passion, just like us. So I want to give you a little bit of encouragement today, because this is God's yearbook, and his yearbook is filled with pictures of people just like you. People who fear, people who tremble, people who question, and people who've gone through a hard time. And it is okay, because those are the people that God uses, and God uses you. So what is the secret of the Apostle Paul? Because we know that he continued on. He spent 1.5 years in Corinth ministering to these people. And he encountered opposition that we will see. He encountered troubles just like you and I have. Every day, something new. And it says, and Paul came down, departed Athens, and came down to Corinth. So here's one of the first things I kind of want to point out to us who are in God's yearbook. And oh, by the way, you're in God's yearbook because he put you there. You didn't get there. It wasn't determined by your acceptance. It was by God's choice. According to he has chosen us in him before the foundation of the world, that we should be holy and without blame before him in love, having predestinated us unto the adoption of children by Jesus Christ, according to the good pleasure of his will. Our snapshots are in God's yearbook because of a choice by God, an action by God, and an offering by Jesus Christ. And there's a lot of joy in being who God has called you to be. Well, God has called us to serve him, to spread the good news of who he is. The Apostle Paul was one of those people who had the same troubles that we do. But we see one of the secrets of the Apostle Paul's success, because it says that he came down to Corinth. Brothers and sisters, he didn't quit. He didn't stop, because no one finds God's promises in life when they quit on God. All of Paul's experiences, and we have them written and abound, all of Paul's experiences are many, but if he had quit, then he wouldn't have experienced them. And so I want to just say to the person right now who continues through the struggles and through the troubles and through the pain, there is a moment where you're going to be able to look back and see God's guiding hand on your life. And to the quitter, what you'll see is failure. But to the one who endures, you will see God's hand, and you might not recognize God's hand, but I can tell you, looking back, you'll be able to see it. So Paul didn't quit. He didn't quit when his team broke up and Barnabas and John Mark continued another way. He didn't quit when he wasn't sure why God was not leading him where he wanted to go, which was to Asia, but rather called him over to Macedonia. And when he went to where God had called him because of the Macedonian vision, it still didn't get any easier. He didn't lay down on the task when he was physically attacked. And could we have blamed Paul if he had just thrown up his hands and gone on back to Tarshish? I mean, isn't it reasonable that he would have been through all these troubles and just said, you know what, I'm going to stop? So one of the key things for us is don't quit. Weary not in well-doing. And then, because of that, it says that Paul got strengthened. This is what it says in verse 2. He went on down to Corinth from Athens in verse 2 and found a certain Jew named Aquila. Now, what I like about this is sometimes it takes two weak people to build up a good one. In Paul's case, he actually came to Aquila and Priscilla, and so God put together three people here. But sometimes, brothers and sisters, here's the fact of the matter. You and I need people like us who are about the same thing. You see, Aquila and his wife Priscilla, they were Jews who were faithful to the cause. And Paul found them. And together they would strengthen each other. That is why the Bible says, do not forsake the assembling together of the saints. Brothers and sisters, get to people who are like you, who are about the same things that you are about. That's what Paul did. And he found a certain Jew by the name of Aquila. And God brings these people together, pairs them with this couple with the beaten apostle at key moments in their lives. And kind of finding a friend to share is always a way to gain balance in a situation. We are not to be unequally yoked. So he found people that he had a lot in common with. And he found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately came from Italy with his wife Priscilla. And here's the parenthetical, because Claudius, who was an emperor of Rome, it says, because Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome and came unto them. So the second people who shows up in our Corinthian yearbook is going to be Aquila and Priscilla. How did they get there? They got there because God begins in your upheaval. How did Aquila and Priscilla wind up in Corinth? Because Claudius had an anti-Semitic moment and ordered all Jews out of Rome. So they travel on over to Corinth. What would have looked like an absolute end, what would have looked like upheaval, what would have looked like, oh no, what I'm going to do because now I'm a refugee, well, that's where God really looks good. That's just a starting block for God. God takes what looks like a dead end and uses it as a beginning. Let me ask you something right now. Are any of y'all in a situation that you would say, this is a dead end? Where life is not turning out how you expected. Maybe you didn't get that promotion. Maybe you didn't get into that school. Maybe you got dumped. During this dead end phase, nothing makes sense. But our God, He's still on the throne. And He is still sovereign. In our what appears to be a dead end situation, and you might have dead end words in your life, like cancer, bankruptcy, infertility, unemployment. And you'll find yourselves asking, why is this happening to me? God, did I miss your will? Was this just a dream that I thought up for myself? But when you start asking those questions, you're at a dead end. And while you're stuck and kind of waiting, you need to remember what God can do. Because the situation might be out of your control, but nothing is out of God's control. Instead of focusing on what appears to be a dead end, focus instead on who God is and what He can do. Romans 4:17 puts it like this. Abraham believed God, who brings dead things back to life and creates new things from nothing. God, He brings dead things back to life, and He creates new things out of nothing. So here are two of the many things that God can do that you can't do. He can bring the dead back to life. And He can create something from nothing. And if God can give a dead man life, He can give life to a dead career, to a dead relationship. He can create something out of a dead dream. And He can bring something new out of a financial dead end. So if you're in a situation that's out of control, let me tell you something. Positive thinking is worthless. Positive thinking can only get you so far. Because when you're a dead end, positive thinking doesn't get you through the dead end. Only faith can get you out of the dead end. Jesus says in Luke chapter 18, if y'all remember, with man it's impossible, but with God anything is possible. You see, that's not positive thinking. That's faith. And you need faith in God because He can control what you can't. So are you literally today like a refugee? Maybe you're a refugee of lost dreams, a refugee of a lost job, a refugee of a lost diagnosis, but many of us are refugees from something. If you're a refugee, I got great news for you. Your plan might look like a dead end, but God uses every day dead-end people to accomplish His will. And that's the greatest hope in the world. Verse 3, and because he, that's Paul, was of the same trade, he stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. And we know from scriptures past that Paul was a tent maker. And by the way, the phrasing of this was their livelihood. And it says that Paul stayed with them and worked. Day after day, Paul went to work. A lot can be accomplished in your work. And this is what Paul would do. He'd go to work and he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath and tried to persuade the Jews and the Greeks. So Here's what Paul finds himself in. Paul hooks up with Priscilla and Aquila. He goes to work, and when the opportunity presents itself on the Sabbath day, he goes and he talks about the Lord, and then he goes back to work. It wasn't a bivocation. That was his job. He did his job, and when the opportunity presented himself, he would talk about the Lord. But, he was 50 miles from Athens, a very difficult city. And there was that pattern that he had: preach, revile, go away. Preach, revile, go away. It happened in Galatia, Thessalonica, Macedonia. It happened in Athens. It's going to happen here too. And it says, so Paul, at this point, with these doubts and these fears that he had, he needed some encouragement. And we have a good God. Verse 5. And when Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia, Paul was pressed in the Spirit. That meant that he really felt this. And so he testified and started testifying to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. So first he would go and reason with them. Now he's being very explicit. Everything that we were talking about, in other words, he built a foundation with them. In other words, he built a relationship with them. He just didn't start going over there and smacking them in the face. At first he's like reasoning. And what that indicates was he's like, this says that there's going to come a Messiah. And maybe it's not. And so the next Sunday is, we're talking about that Messiah, and you've talked about the victorious Messiah, but, there's also a suffering Messiah here. And then the next week he could follow up on that. And then he was pressed in the Spirit. It's like, okay, now's the time. Now's the time to proclaim Jesus Christ. If you want to share Christ, build the relationship. Let them know that you love them. Don't just go over there and hand them a tract. Don't go over there and tell them they're on their way to hell. It wasn't up to them to begin with. Build the relationship. This is what he did. And Silas and Timotheus were come from Macedonia. Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was the Christ. And when you have that message, you're going to meet some opposition. And when they opposed themselves and blasphemed, he shook his raiment and said unto them, your blood be upon your heads. I am clean, and from henceforth I will go unto the Gentiles. So when Silas and Timothy arrive in verse 5, here's what they do. And we know this from 1 Thessalonians 3, we know this from 2 Corinthians 11, we know this from Philippians 4. First thing they did was they told him about how the people he left behind were standing for the faith. And then the next thing they did was they brought the gift offering from the church of Philippi. So you see Paul, as he's going struggling, he's getting little pieces of purpose that are being laid out for him, just like it was for Ruth. He would get encouragement on a spiritual level. All your work is bearing fruit, Paul. Keep doing it. Keep going. And brothers and sisters, you and I need some spiritual uplifting sometime. But not only that, they were very practical too, and they said, oh, by the way, Paul, I want to encourage you not only spiritually, but I want to encourage you financially too. Here's the gift from the church over in Philippi. So he got lifted up. And it says that the people wouldn't receive him. He says, your blood be upon your head. He's done what he could do. If they can't receive the gospel message, the good news of what Christ has done for them, really there's not much else. And so Paul says, I'm going to move on. And it says, and he departed thence and entered into a certain man's house named Justus, one who worshiped God, whose house, underline this, was joined hard to the synagogue. In other words, brothers and sisters, it had the same wall. So do you understand the kind of comic relief that we just got here? Paul's like, I am done with you people. I'm going to go preach to the Gentiles. Next door. Hey, Justice, what's going on, buddy? And revival breaks out next door. And the people right here on the other side of the wall, because that's what it means to be joined hard to the synagogue, on the other side of the wall, didn't get to enjoy it, even though the good news was just feet away. How many of us are just this close? Well, the Apostle Paul was. And he speaks first of the word of the cross to the Jews. That's what 1 Corinthians 1:23 says. And it arose a lot of enmity against him. And it says, and many of the Corinthians believed. And this is the whole point of Acts chapter 18. God is doing extraordinary things through ordinary people. God has a plan for you. And even Paul, who we often put on a pedestal, was an everyday guy. Verse 9, then he spake the Lord to Paul in the night by a vision. Be not afraid, but speak. Hold not thy peace, for I am with thee. And here's what the Lord says. Here's a couple of promises. I am with thee, and no man shall harm thee, for I have much people in this city. And he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them. So the first thing that God says to Paul, and it's great to be encouraged by other believers. It's great to have the financial encouragement of other believers, but it's especially meaningful to hear direct from God, to have that peace that passes understanding. And what is that direct communication that God gave Paul? He gave him two promises. I am with thee. It's the same promise every one of you has. We call him not only Jesus, we call him Emmanuel, God with us. He says, I'm with you, and no man is going to harm you. And brothers and sisters, we've said this before, and we're going to say it again. Nothing that truly matters is at stake, because our eternity has been paid for. So come on, cancer, take my body, because it's going to be resurrected. Come on, people, cast me in prison, because I got a home that's going to outlast these rocks and these iron bars. Bring it. Nothing that matters is really at stake. Because on the other side of eternity, all things are redeemed. And this is what's going on. And I hope that encourages you, because it encouraged Paul, this everyday guy. And I want you to notice something. Paul, the Lord says, hey, Paul, here's what I want you to know. You're going to be okay. I love you. Everything's going to be all right. I'm with you. I have much people in this city. If you highlight your Bible, I'd really encourage you to highlight that. God had a people before the gospel was ever preached. They are his people. Because being his people is not dependent upon your belief. It was dependent on Jesus' belief, Jesus' obedience, Jesus' crucifixion, and Jesus' choice. We believe in a Jesus plus nothing plan. Now, the benefit of a belief is that they get to know the peace of God. They get to know the one that died for them. They get to know about the promises that God is with us even at the dead ends. Even when the yearbook photo looks dorky, God is with you. And they also get to know about the eternal security that they have. No man can harm thee. Romans 8, for I am persuaded that neither life, nor death, nor principalities, nor powers, nor things that are, or things that are going to be able to come, are going to be able to separate you from the love of God. Nothing separates you from the love of God. You have eternal security, and no man can take you away from God's hand. And he says, I have a lot of people. So all the evils that we have in this modern society, and I find great encouragement by these snapshots. Because we live in a society where we are more connected than ever. We have more friends and more LinkedIn connections, and yet we are more isolated than ever before. We stay in our homes and have virtual relationships instead of real ones. And I kind of think that this is part of Satan's deception to divide and conquer, and that Satan replaces real relationship with fake ones and virtual ones that really leave us empty on the inside. And that's why Hebrews 10:24 tells us, let us consider how we can spurn one another on towards love. Spurn one another. Kind of like Aquila and Priscilla were doing to Paul. It's good to be connected with people. Let's see how we can spur one another on towards love and good deeds, not giving up, meeting together as the manner of some is, but encouraging one another, and all the more you see as the day is approaching. And what we saw in Acts chapter 2 was how the disciples meet together day by day. And sometimes we may not feel like being with one another, but we need to keep on being with one another. And Jesus gives us this promise, surely I am with you always, even into the end of the age. Let's land this plane. In the last 100 years, we have split the atom. We've made a household industry of cutting out, of out of the movement of electrons. We've reached the stars and left footprints on the moon. We've eradicated many diseases that have plagued mankind for a number of years. We've increased our lifespan by a substantial margin. We can be placed on an operating table and knocked out in a matter of seconds, which will allow us a deeper dive into the anatomy to solve those intractable defects and wounds. And we've made it clear that every child should get clean water and sufficient food. We've gained so much ground in science and technology and the economy and medicine. We live in a world of fast jets and computerized handheld computers. And yet, with all the incredible advancements in technology and science and medicine, the savagery of human nature still exists. I just got assigned a case where a mother beat her 8-year-old child to death with a rolling pin. There's another case that arose a week ago where a man who came from Bosnia to pursue the American dream was killed over $50. All the advances in technology and in science and in medicine cannot cure the human condition. Only the gospel can for the child of God. And God has much people. And some of them are murderers, and some of them are thieves. Some of them are drunks. Some of them are the unfaithful. God has his children out there, and the only way that they're going to be able to turn their lives around is through the good news of Jesus Christ. And God uses who to get that news out? Everyday people. You and me. You know, in 1972, NASA launched Pioneer 10, and its primary mission was actually go to Jupiter, which is approximately about 1 billion miles away from Earth. And it was to go to Jupiter, snap some photos, and send it back. And it kept going. And it went another 1 billion miles and got to Saturn. Then it traveled another 1 billion miles and it got to Uranus. Hey, try and change your name, you know. Oh, come on, that was funny. I mean, what idiot named that anyway? Then it went to Neptune, and then 25 years later, in 1997, it passed Pluto. 25 years later. It was only designed to go for 3 years. And the transmitter that transmitted the images back, 8 watts. Right? Right? I mean, I don't know about y'all, but I like 100 watt. Some of y'all like your little soft white, 60 watts, and some of y'all are 40 watts. But 8 watts? Are you serious? 25 years later, we got images back from an 8-watt transmitter? Man, if mankind can do that with 8 watts, imagine what God can do with you. Because I got to be honest with you, sometimes I feel like a 40-watt light bulb in a 100-watt world. But even if I'm only 8 watts, even if I'm an apostle who consented to and took part in the killing of early Christians, God can use me, and God can use you. And that's the snapshot of the church in 2024. If you'd like to be part of God's great mission, because you are part of his family, we'll give you that chance as we stand and sing hymn number 358. If you